Hi everyone, this is the reading overview video for week 2 of BEH385. Chapter 3 and 4 this week. Chapter 3 deals with the ethics and politics of social research. And this is a really great chapter. It gives kind of a general idea of how social science research fits into kind of the world at large. In this chapter, we're talking about kind of the ethics in social research, like what are the things that we need to be worried about as we're studying people, we're studying human subjects. Talking about some really important things that have happened in history and why we have concern for this now, and the process and protocol that we go through to make sure that as we're learning about people and studying people, we're also being responsible researchers and caring for and respecting for the safety, privacy, and security of those people that we are studying. So this reading goes nicely along with the assignment that you have this week of completing an IRB protocol. So in our reading in chapter 3, you learn about the different ways that we are concerned about the safety and privacy of people that we study. You learn about how we go about making sure that our research respects those things and kind of why, and some historical examples of why we have that process now. And then in the assignment this week, you'll actually go through a mock process of what that looks like. So the bulk of this chapter is about why do we do that? Why do we care about it? I really like this textbook in that it gives nice narrative into why the things that we study are important and how they work together in the greater world of social science research. So we'll go through and talk about why it's important for people to have voluntary participation, why it's important for individuals to know that no harm will come to them. And this is where we have some really notable historic examples of where people were basically harmed purposefully for the purpose of research, and kind of this dark history in social science research. I'm talking about how we protect the anonymity of people and the confidentiality of the results that come out, especially when you think about doing research about things dealing with human interactions that are really personal, things like health history or sexual orientation or lifestyle, income. A lot of really personal information goes into understanding humans, and we wouldn't want for individuals to be detectable when we're writing up our research, when we're talking about our research. That would be really violating to individuals, and that's why that's kind of an important part of the research process. And then the text goes on to talk more about situations where deception is a viable portion of research and how and when that's appropriate and how we handle that. And then there's discussion about the concept of institutional review boards, or IRB. And this is kind of what's set in place to, they're sort of the gatekeepers between proposed research and research that we move forward in doing. And it's that institutional review board is the governing board, or the people that we use as the gatekeepers for determining if our research is safe or not for individual participants. And then after kind of talking about this generally, you get some really great hands-on examples, illustrations of ethical controversies within social science research. And then there's also some nice discussion about the politics of social research. And those kind of mirror the theoretical frameworks from last week that we talked about. We kind of have some really good information about how politics shapes social research. So it's just kind of important to be aware of the fact that kind of when we do research, especially quantitative research, it can be tempting to think that we're coming in a very unbiased way, that, we have these unbiased research questions, we have this data that we're collecting in an unbiased manner, and that we're going to do this analysis, and that our research is just not slanted in one direction or another. But this chapter does a really good job, I think, of kind of just describing how that's not necessarily true, that the ways that we collect data, the things or the tools we use to collect data, the questions that we ask, all of those sorts of things can be colored by the biases and life experiences that we come to the table with. And we need to be aware of those things. We need to be mindful of how different political underpinnings might affect the research that we do, the questions we ask, the way that we ask those questions, the way that we write up those questions. All of those things are really important as researchers to be aware of. And, we should be very upfront about how those biases might be a part of our research processes, and make sure that they don't in any way influence the results that we report, because the greater community is going to be using our results to further science, to further our inquiry into the human experience. And so it's important that we try our very best to make sure that we don't have any sort of biases really affecting the way that we go about collecting data and conducting our research and the ways that we write up that research. So chapter 3 is really just kind of a broad overview of the ways that we need to be careful that we protect people and the ways that we need to be careful that our research isn't biased in one way or another. And then that goes along with your assignment this week with doing your IRB protocol and thinking through the ways that individuals might potentially be at harm in a research experience. And so that's kind of what we're doing in this week, and what we're doing generally in this class as a whole is trying to give you the experience of what it means to be doing human subject research and what are all the parts involved in that. So the assignment, the mock IRB form, really goes along with this reading here in chapter 3. Then in chapter 4, we go on to talking more about what's involved in designing a research project in general, and this is helpful in moving forward. We aren't doing a full proposal this week, but we are working some more on finalizing a topic and thinking through research questions, and this chapter reading about research design is helpful with that. In this chapter, we talk about the different purposes of research. So if you're still working on your research questions, this is helpful to think through, what are you trying to do in your research project? Are you trying to explore or describe or explain something? And those are the 3 purposes of research. And this chapter talks about those and gives examples of each and what kinds of research, what sorts of questions are being asked with each of those 3 purposes of research. So those of you who haven't quite finished your research questions, who haven't gotten that approved yet, this will be helpful. And even for those of you who did get approval, this reading should help you kind of iron out any small details that you might want to talk about or rephrase or refine in your research questions. And then we go through and there's some explanation about nomoethic explanations of research, kind of the idea of causality, and that's really important in the work that we're doing in this class and in the last class too. We talked about quantitative versus qualitative research, talked about when there's correlational studies versus causal studies, and so this is kind of giving some more illustrations about the ideas of nomoethic explanations for causality. Then there's some discussion about necessary and sufficient causes, and there's some good graphics and explanations there about what's necessary for having causal claims and then what's sufficient for having causal claims. Then we go on to talk about unit of analysis. Unit of analysis is a pretty important idea, especially for beginning researchers, as you're thinking through your research questions and then thinking through your data collection methods and the tools that you'll use. Oftentimes, unit of analysis can get lost in there in those early steps, and then you might choose a measurement tool that isn't aimed at the correct unit of analysis. You need to think about at what unit of analysis your research questions are functioning. Who is it that you want to answer questions about? Is it about individuals? Is it about organizations? Is it about something larger than organizations like counties or states? Those sorts of things are kind of what you're going to think about when you're designing that research process. Now, because the research project in this class is based on data that's been collected previously and that's already being provided for you, you don't have this large area of units of analysis to really be concerned about, but it's important to be thinking about these on a broader scale as you might move on to do other research for other classes or even in your careers in the future. And then there's some nice description about how you consider time in the research that you do. So whether you're doing cross-sectional studies or longitudinal studies, and basically the difference there is cross-sectional is that you look at one point in time across different groups and different types of people, as opposed to longitudinal studies where you pick a specific kind of person or group and you look at that same group or group of people over different time points to see how they change over time versus trends across different groups within one point of time in cross-sectional studies. And then there's a whole section on how to design a research project, and it goes through the different steps of, from your very beginning starting points to thinking about your research questions, how you're going to conceptualize all of the important ideas in that research process, what methods you're going to use to answer your research questions. And as the text says multiple times, the research method is often pretty well defined by the research questions. Then going through how you're going to operationalize answering those questions and that research method. That's, what kind of methods you're going to use, how you're going to exact those methods, and population and sampling. What groups of people are you going to be looking at? through your research. How are you going to go about picking that group of people? What's the rationale for the group of people that you use? Then collecting your data, processing that data, analyzing that data, and then kind of how you're going to write up the application of those results. So the last part of this chapter goes through that whole process, and that whole process is really kind of the goal of this class in general. So there's some good descriptions of, from beginning to end, what does the research process look like, how to write up a proposal, and then circling back to the ethics of research design that goes along with what we read in chapter 3. So that's kind of a brief summary of what's happening in chapters 3 and 4. If you have any questions about that reading, please feel free to send me an email. Thanks.